Some feelings arrive quietly, like a breeze through an open window. You hardly notice until the room feels different. I never planned to live with my uncle. If you had asked me a year ago where I'd be at 22, I would have said something like, finishing my final design portfolio, probably in a cramped apartment with noisy neighbors and a cat I didn't have time to name. But life doesn't always follow the script. It finds a way to thrill us, tease us, if you know what I mean. Instead, I found myself in a quiet countryside home, surrounded by pine trees and silence that stretched for miles. The house didn't hum with city noise or the clatter of a nearby highway. It breathed. Every creak in the floorboards, every rustling branch against the window, it all felt alive, peaceful, still. It was supposed to be temporary. My name is Elena Reyes, and I moved in with my uncle Marcus and his wife Celeste after my mom accepted a research position overseas. There wasn't time to plan much, and Marcus was the only family nearby willing to take me in while I finished my last semester of college. I thought I'd be here for a few months, finish school, save some money, and move on. But something changed. Not outside. The house, the trees, the routine, they all stayed the same. It was inside me, and it had something to do with Marcus. He wasn't a typical uncle figure. He never treated me like a child, even when I was one. He taught me how to change a tire, helped me submit my first scholarship application, and once drove 3 hours just to sit through my high school art exhibit. He was present in the way most people only pretend to be. I admired him. I always had. But admiration has a way of evolving, quietly and without permission. The first time I noticed it, it was nothing. A glance held a moment too long. A breath that caught when I realized we were alone in the kitchen. The soft sound of a spoon stirring tea, the only noise between us. Harmless things. Things you could brush off. Still, I felt it. Marcus's wife, Celeste, was kind but distant. She was one of those people who spoke in curated sentences, like her emotions had been edited for clarity. We got along fine, but we weren't close. She spent most of her time in town, working at the Historical Society and volunteering at the community garden on weekends. I often found myself alone with Marcus in the evenings. He'd sit at the long oak dining table, reading or scrolling through recipes he'd never try. I'd be on the couch nearby, sketching. Occasionally, we'd talk, but more often, we didn't. We just shared space, until it didn't feel like just space anymore. One night, I caught him watching me. Not in a way that made me uncomfortable, but in a way that made me wonder what he was thinking. His eyes lingered, not on my face or hands or anything specific, but like he was seeing something he wasn't sure he should be seeing. When our eyes met, he looked away quickly, cleared his throat, and asked something ordinary like, "How's your project coming?" But his voice was rougher than usual, like something lived just beneath it. I told myself I was imagining it. Still, I started noticing more. The way his hand would rest on my shoulder a second longer when he passed behind me. The way he seemed to listen more closely when I laughed. The way his expression softened when he looked at me, as if he were remembering something, or maybe forgetting something else. It was subtle, unspoken, but it made everything feel heavier. I tried to keep things normal, focused on my classes, my freelance work, the digital illustrations I was submitting to a few local galleries. But the stillness of the house made it hard to ignore the shift. The quiet had a shape now. It pressed in around me, making me feel like I was waiting for something to happen, even though I didn't know what. One Saturday afternoon, Marcus helped me carry a broken printer down to the garage. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. But when he reached to take it from me, our hands touched, just for a second. His thumb grazed the inside of my wrist and lingered. It was barely a moment, but I felt it. A spark of something that didn't belong. He didn't say anything, just took the printer and walked ahead. But I stood there for a few seconds longer than I needed to, staring at the spot where our hands had met, wondering what it meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the wind in the trees and the occasional creak of footsteps in the hallway. I wondered if he felt it too, or if this was just me, misreading everything like some lonely, restless girl desperate for connection. The next morning, he made breakfast like nothing had happened. "Do you want toast?" he asked, holding up a slice. I nodded, watching his hands as he reached for the butter. They were strong hands, capable, familiar. But now, they felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. We sat down across from each other at the table, the toast between us. Celeste was out for the day, helping with a local art fair. We talked about the weather, my classes, his plans to repaint the porch, but the air between us was filled with everything we didn't say. After breakfast, I retreated to my room, pretending to work on a design brief. I stared at my laptop screen, unmoving. My heart felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't know what was happening. Not really. I wasn't trying to feel this way. I wasn't chasing anything. But the way Marcus looked at me sometimes, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he didn't want to finish, it made me wonder if he was feeling it too. And if he was, what then? I closed my laptop and turned toward the window. The sky was soft and gray, the kind of gray that made the trees look like watercolor. I knew something had shifted. I just didn't know where it would lead. But I did know this. The house wasn't just quiet anymore. It was charged. Like a current ran through the walls, waiting for someone to touch the switch. And maybe, just maybe, I already had. The days blurred into a kind of quiet rhythm. Mornings began with the smell of coffee and the sound of birds outside the kitchen window. Evenings ended with warm lights, soft footsteps in the hallway, and the low hum of Marcus's voice talking about repairs or some new recipe he wanted to try but never did. It should have felt peaceful, but it didn't. Not entirely. There was something beneath the surface now, a tension that hummed just low enough that no one could name it, but high enough that I felt it in the pit of my stomach. I started spending more time in the studio space Marcus had cleared out for me at the back of the house. It used to be a storage room, but now it was filled with my sketchbooks, digital tablet, and a small desk with uneven legs. The window overlooked the garden, where Celeste had planted rows of lavender and basil. It was my hideaway, a space where I could draw, think, and avoid the strange weight settling over my chest whenever Marcus was near. Still, I couldn't help noticing when he passed by the doorway. Sometimes he'd pause, just for a second. He'd glance in, offer a smile, and ask, "Need anything?" "No, I'm okay," I'd reply, pretending to focus on my screen. But after he walked away, I'd catch myself staring at the empty doorway, wondering what he was thinking, wondering what I was thinking. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel. I wasn't sure where admiration ended and something else began. I wasn't even sure if anything had begun at all. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just grasping at closeness in a house that felt too big for 3 people who barely spoke about anything real. One rainy afternoon, I found myself sitting in the living room with Marcus. Celeste was out again, this time meeting with a group of artists organizing a fundraiser for the town's restoration project. Marcus had been working on a leaky faucet earlier, and now he was flipping through a home repair magazine that looked like it hadn't been updated since 2004. I was curled up in the armchair by the window, sketchbook open on my lap. I wasn't drawing anything in particular, just lines, shapes, the start of a figure I didn't finish. "You've gotten better," he said suddenly, his voice low but clear. I looked up. "At what?" "Drawing," he said, tapping a page I hadn't realized he could see. "You used to rush through your lines. Now they breathe." I blinked. It was a strange compliment, and yet it made my chest tighten. "Thanks," I murmured, closing the sketchbook slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You ever think about illustrating full-time? Making stories come to life?" "All the time," I said, smiling slightly. "But I'm not sure where to start." "You'll figure it out," he said, with a quiet certainty that made me want to believe him. I studied his face, just for a moment. There were lines around his eyes I hadn't noticed before. His hair was starting to gray at the temples. He looked tired, but in a way that made him seem more real. He looked up, and our eyes met. Neither of us looked away immediately. I don't know how long we held that gaze. 2, maybe 3 seconds. just long enough for my skin to warm, for the air to feel heavier than it had a moment ago. Then he cleared his throat and turned back to the magazine. I didn't open my sketchbook again. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the rain tapped softly against the windows. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me. It wasn't inappropriate. Well, not exactly. But it wasn't uncle-like either. It was something else. Something I couldn't name without feeling guilty. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen table. Marcus had gone to town for supplies. Celeste was still asleep. I made coffee and sat in the quiet, wondering why my heart felt like it was balancing on the edge of something I didn't fully understand. Later that week, everything came to a strange kind of head. It was a Thursday evening. Celeste had been called away for an overnight work retreat at the museum, something about cataloging new artifacts. Marcus and I had dinner alone, grilled vegetables, rice, and a salad I'd made from the garden. After dinner, I offered to help clean up. He waved me off. "You cooked," he said, smiling. "I'll handle this." I stood at the counter, drying dishes as he washed. We worked in silence, the kind that felt full rather than awkward. Every so often, our hands would brush. I tried not to flinch, but each touch felt like it left a mark. "Do you miss your mom?" he asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. "Sometimes," I said honestly. "We were never very close, but I miss the idea of her." He nodded. "I get that." "Do you?" I asked softly, turning to look at him. Marcus's hands stilled in the water. He looked up, eyes unreadable. "More than you know." Something passed between us then. Not words, just a charge in the air, a flicker of recognition. Like we were both standing on the same ledge, unsure of what was on the other side. I looked away first. We finished the dishes in silence. As I turned to leave the kitchen, I felt his eyes on me again. Not in a way that made me feel preyed upon, but in a way that made me feel seen. As if he were trying to memorize the shape of me, my presence, my mood, something he couldn't quite touch. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I got up and wandered into the hallway, drawn by the soft glow of light coming from the study. Marcus was there, sitting in his chair, reading. He looked up when I entered. "Can't sleep?" I shook my head. "Me neither," he said, setting the book down. "Come in." I hesitated at the doorway, then stepped inside. We didn't say much. I sat across from him, pulling my knees to my chest. He poured me a cup of tea and handed it to me without a word. We sat like that for nearly an hour. Sometimes he read, sometimes we just listened to the wind outside. It was the kind of silence that felt like it belonged to us. Eventually, I stood to leave. "Good night," I said softly. He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Night, Elena." But as I turned to go, I felt something shift again. A pause. A wait. I stopped in the doorway, unsure why. When I glanced back, he was still watching me. Not with hunger, not with confusion, but with something far more dangerous. Longing, clean, quiet, unspoken, and I felt it in every part of me. The house was quiet again, not the peaceful kind of quiet that came with early mornings and gentle rain. This quiet was heavier, still, but not calm, like the air was holding its breath. Celeste had been gone for 2 nights now, attending a regional museum conference 2 towns over. Marcus had mentioned it just once, offhandedly, and neither of us brought it up again. But I felt the shift the minute she left. The house felt bigger, emptier, and somehow more intimate. I spent most of that first day in the studio, trying to finish a commission for a children's book illustration. I sketched, erased, and redrew the same page 5 times. Nothing felt right. My lines were too stiff, my colors too forced. By evening, I gave up. I wandered into the kitchen, half hoping to find Marcus there and half hoping not to. He was. He stood at the counter, chopping herbs with the rhythm of someone who wasn't really concentrating. The lamp above the stove cast a warm glow over the room, softening everything. "Hungry?" he asked, without looking up. "Not really," I said, even though I hadn't eaten since lunch. He glanced at me. "You should eat something." I shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. Maybe later. He went back to chopping, the knife tapping rhythmically against the cutting board. You're quiet today, I said. So are you. We didn't speak for a while. The only sound was the hiss of olive oil in the pan and the occasional clink of silverware. After a moment, he turned to face me fully. Want to go for a walk? It's not too cold tonight. I hesitated. Now? He nodded. Yeah, just around the property. You've been cooped up all day. I looked at him, searching for some hidden meaning in his face. There wasn't one I could name, but something in his eyes made it hard to say no. Okay, I said quietly. We walked in silence at first, stepping over patches of fallen leaves and gravel paths that wound around the back of the house. The moon was high, casting silver light across the trees and making everything shimmer. I used to come out here when I needed to think, Marcus said after a while. Even before we moved in. This land belonged to my grandparents. Celeste and I restored the house a few years ago. It's beautiful, I said, meaning it. He nodded, hands in his pockets. Sometimes I miss the noise, though. The city, the distractions. Distractions are easier than thinking, I said without thinking. He looked at me, surprised. Then a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. You're not wrong. We came to a small bench beneath the oak tree that marked the edge of the property. He sat down, and after a moment, I joined him. The air between us was cool but charged. I could hear the wind moving through the branches, the soft rustle of leaves. But underneath it all was something else, something unspoken. I feel like I've known you my whole life, I said suddenly, but lately I don't know where we stand. He didn't respond right away. We stand exactly where we've always stood. No, I said softly. We don't. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. Elena? I'm not trying to make things harder, I said quickly. I feel like there's something between us neither of us wants to name. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. You're not imagining it. The honesty in his voice hit me like a wave. I wish I could say you were, he continued. But I've felt it too, and I've tried to ignore it. I've tried to convince myself it's just proximity, familiarity. I looked down at my hands, but it's not. No, he said quietly. It's not. For a long moment, we sat in silence, the kind that wraps around you like a too heavy blanket. I don't know what to do with it, I admitted. I don't even know what it is. He was quiet again. Then, neither do I. I turned to look at him. The moonlight made the lines on his face more defined. He looked older in that moment, and sadder. I'm not trying to ruin anything, I said. I know, he replied. But My voice caught. I feel something, and I don't know if that makes me awful. He looked at me then, really looked at me. You're not awful, Elena. You're human. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was both of us. One moment we were sitting with space between us, and the next, that space was gone. His hand brushed mine, not by accident. This time it was intentional, deliberate. I didn't pull away. His fingers curled gently around mine, and I felt a jolt of something deep in my chest. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the tangle of guilt and longing that swirled inside me. We should go back, he said, though he didn't let go of my hand. I nodded. We stood slowly, his hand still holding mine for a second longer before he let go. The walk back was silent, but not empty. When we reached the house, I paused at the foot of the stairs. Thank you, I said, not entirely sure what I was thanking him for. He gave me a small nod. Sleep well. You too. That night, I didn't sleep. My mind wandered to places it certainly should not have. What I thought was for a different time. The next morning, the sound of a car door startled me from my thoughts. I glanced out the window and saw Celeste unloading a suitcase from the trunk. My stomach dropped. I hadn't realized how different the house had felt without her until she returned. The air shifted the moment she stepped inside. Brisk, efficient, composed. "Elena," she called from the hallway. "Can you help me with these boxes?" I came downstairs and took one from her arms. "Thanks," she said with a small smile. "The conference went longer than planned. You and Marcus manage okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, everything was fine." She studied me for a moment. "You look tired." "Didn't sleep much." "Too much screen time," she teased gently. "That studio is going to ruin your eyes." I forced a smile. "I'll take more breaks." We unpacked quietly, and I couldn't help noticing how her presence filled the room. She had a way of commanding space without trying. I wondered if Marcus felt it too. Later that evening, I heard them talking in the kitchen while I sat upstairs. Their voices were low, steady, nothing urgent, but something about it made me feel like an outsider in a home I was supposed to belong to. I stayed in my room. The following evening, I was in the studio working on a new commission when I heard a soft knock at the door. "Come in," I said. It was Marcus. He stepped inside, glancing around the room. "You've made it your own." "I guess so." He hesitated. "I wanted to check in. You've been quiet since yesterday." I shrugged. "Just tired." He nodded. "Me too." There was a pause. "I haven't stopped thinking about the other night," he said finally. I looked up, my heart skipping. "Me neither." He exhaled. "I don't know what this is becoming. I just know it's not nothing." I stood slowly, setting my sketchbook aside. I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. Neither do I. We stood there, the air between us thick again. I stepped closer without meaning to, just enough to see the flicker in his eyes. But before either of us could speak, a voice rang out from the hallway. "Marcus?" It was Celeste. He stepped back instantly as if burned. "I'll be right there," he called. I turned away, my cheeks hot. "I should go," he said softly. I nodded, though I couldn't look at him. He lingered for a second longer, then left. Later that night, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring into the dark. Celeste hadn't said anything unusual. She hadn't looked at me strangely, but something in her tone when she called Marcus had been different. Not suspicious, but aware. I wondered if she knew. If she could feel the shift the way I did. Then, just before midnight, there was another knock. I opened the door slowly. It was Celeste. She didn't look angry, just tired. "Can we talk?" she asked. I stepped aside. She sat on the edge of the window seat, looking out into the night. "I've always believed that people are more complicated than we give them credit for," she began. "Life doesn't fit into neat boxes. Neither do feelings." I sat across from her, silent. "I don't know what's happening between you and Marcus, and I don't need you to explain it," she said quietly. "But I'm not blind. I see the way things have changed." I opened my mouth, but no words came. "No one plans for this kind of thing," she said. "But it doesn't mean it's meaningless, and it doesn't mean it can be ignored." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "I never meant for—" "I know," she said gently. "You're not a villain, Elena. You're young. You're trying to find your place. So is he." I stared at her, unsure what to say. "I just wanted you to know that I see you," she said. "Both of you. And whatever happens next, don't let silence decide it for you." She stood, placing her hand lightly on my shoulder. Then she left. Morning broke slowly, filtering through the curtains in muted shades of gold and gray. I sat up in bed before the alarm had a chance to sound, my body already awake, my mind heavy with all the things left unsaid the night before. Celeste's words echoed louder in the daylight. "Don't let silence decide it for you." I didn't know what to do with that kind of permission. It wasn't a green light. It wasn't encouragement. But it was something softer, a door left slightly ajar, an unspoken understanding that nothing about this situation could be categorized easily. I rose, dressed, and made my way downstairs. The house was quiet in that early morning way that made every movement feel louder than it was. My footsteps on the stairs, the sound of the faucet turning on, the smallest clink of a spoon against a mug. When I entered the kitchen, Marcus was already there. He looked up from his coffee, his eyes tired but alert. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We stood in silence for a few seconds, the kind of silence charged with too many layers to untangle in one breath. "I talked to Celeste last night," I said finally. He set his mug down. "She told me." I sat across from him, running my fingers along the edge of the table. "She didn't yell. She didn't even raise her voice." "She wouldn't," he said quietly. "That's not who she is." "No," I agreed. "But I think she knows. About everything." Marcus looked down at his hands. They were steady, but his shoulders were tense. "She's always seen more than she says," he murmured, "even when I wish she didn't." There was a long pause. "What do we do now?" I asked, barely able to meet his eyes. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, staring out the window above the sink. Outside, the garden shimmered with early dew. A bird landed briefly on the porch before flying off again. "I've asked myself that question 100 times," he said, "and I keep coming back to the same place. Which is that there isn't a clear answer. There's no plan for this, no roadmap." I nodded slowly. "I know." He looked at me then, and for the first time in days, he didn't look away. "I never meant for this to happen. I need you to know that, but I also can't pretend it didn't." "I don't want to pretend either," I said. He reached across the table, his hand resting gently on mine. It was a simple touch. No tension, no urgency, just presence. "I care about you, Elena," he said. "But what we do with that care, that's the hard part." I swallowed. "Do you regret it?" "No," he said without hesitation, "but I'm afraid of it." "Me too." We sat like that for a while, hand in hand. The silence no longer something we were avoiding, but something we were holding together. The rest of the day passed in a strange kind of stillness. Not quite peace, but not